I never thought I'd be the kind of person to write something like this, but after everything that happened, I realized there's no clean way to summarize it without sounding like I'm leaving things out. So, I'm just going to tell it the way it happened, from the beginning, because the beginning matters more than people think. Before any of this, my life was stable. Not exciting, not dramatic, just stable in a way that takes years to build and seconds to lose. I ran a consulting business that focused on logistics and internal systems. Nothing flashy, no big branding, no public recognition, just long-term clients who stayed because we solved problems quietly and consistently. I built it over more than 15 years, starting from nothing. And by the time this story begins, it was the center of my life. I met my wife Claire when I was 37. She wasn't looking for someone to rescue her, and that was part of why we worked. She had already been married once, already divorced, already learned how to take care of herself. She had a son from that marriage, Daniel, who was almost grown by the time I came into their lives. When I first met him, he was polite but distant. Not rude, not hostile, just quiet in a way that felt deliberate. I didn't try to replace his father, and he didn't seem interested in letting me. We existed in the same space without really intersecting. At dinners, he listened more than he talked. When he did speak, it was usually to answer a question directly, never to volunteer information. At the time, I thought it was shyness. In hindsight, it was something else entirely, but I didn't recognize it yet. Claire and I built a life together that felt solid. We didn't rush anything. We moved slowly, intentionally, the way people do when they've both already seen what happens when you don't. Daniel went to college and chose to study business administration. It seemed like a practical decision, and I didn't think much of it at the time. During one summer break, I offered him an internship at my company. Not because he asked, and not because I felt obligated, but because I genuinely thought it would be useful for him to see how a real business operated outside of textbooks and lectures. He accepted without much reaction. He showed up on time every day, did the work he was given, and didn't complain. He asked very few questions, but when he did, they were specific, focused. He watched meetings closely, took notes, remembered things I assumed most interns would forget within a week. I remember thinking that he was quiet but capable, and I felt a small sense of pride, knowing that he was learning from something I had built. Looking back, that was the first mistake I made, not offering him the internship, but assuming that because he was quiet, he was passive. I thought I was teaching him how my business worked. I didn't realize he was also learning where its weak points were. At the time, none of that felt important. Claire was healthy, the company was stable, and the future looked predictable in the best possible way. If you had asked me then where I thought my life would be in 5 years, I would have given you a boring answer, and I would have been happy about it. I had no idea how quickly boring was about to disappear. Everything started to change slowly, which is probably why I didn't notice it right away. Claire didn't get sick all at once. There was no dramatic moment where everything flipped overnight. It began with small things: fatigue that didn't go away, doctor's appointments that kept getting rescheduled, tests that took longer than they should have. At first, we treated it like an inconvenience. Then it became routine. Then it became our life. Hospitals have a way of shrinking everything else. Time starts moving differently. Days blur together. You stop thinking in weeks or months and start thinking in appointments. During that period, my attention shifted without me consciously deciding to let it. I was still involved in the business, still checking in, still making decisions, but I wasn't as present as I used to be. I told myself it was temporary, that once things stabilized, I'd step fully back in. That's when Daniel began stepping forward. At first, it made sense. He was already familiar with the company. He had interned there.
He knew the people. When I asked him to sit in on meetings or handle small things, he did it efficiently. He didn't overstep. He didn't argue. He didn't push back. If anything, he seemed careful not to draw attention to himself. I trusted that. In hindsight, I trusted it too much. As Claire's health declined, Daniel's role quietly expanded. He started answering emails that used to come directly to me. He began speaking on behalf of the company in meetings I wasn't attending. People got used to seeing him there, used to hearing his voice instead of mine. At the time, I thought that was a good thing. I thought it meant continuity, stability.
I didn't see it for what it was, a shift. What I also didn't think about enough was something I had done years earlier, long before Claire got sick. For tax reasons, and because it seemed practical at the time, I had transferred the majority of the company shares to her. It wasn't a decision I agonized over. I still ran everything. I still made all the decisions. On paper, though, ownership had changed, and paper has a way of becoming very important when circumstances shift. I knew, in theory, that if something happened to Claire, those shares would pass to Daniel. I knew it in the abstract, the way you know something without ever imagining it becoming relevant. I didn't connect it to reality. I didn't connect it to power. I certainly didn't connect it to myself being on the outside. Claire passed away on a Tuesday morning, quietly. No dramatic last conversation, no long goodbye, just a phone call that changed everything and left an empty space where a person used to be. The days that followed felt unreal. The funeral was small. Daniel stood next to me the entire time. He didn't cry much. He looked controlled, composed. I remember thinking how well he was holding himself together, especially given everything he'd lost. 5 days later, he asked me to come into the office. I didn't think anything of it. I assumed we'd talk about next steps, about how we were going to move forward, about the future of the company, and what role I would play now. I walked into that meeting believing, without question, that I still belonged there. Daniel closed the door behind me. He didn't sit behind the desk. He sat across from me, which felt intentional in a way I couldn't place at the time. He spoke calmly, like someone delivering information rather than having a conversation. He said that as the majority shareholder, he had decided it was time to restructure leadership, that the company needed a new direction. Then he slid a folder across the desk. I didn't open it right away. I already knew what it was. Termination papers. I remember staring at them longer than necessary, not because I was angry, but because I was trying to understand how we had arrived at that moment without me seeing it coming. 15 years of work reduced to a few pages, a decision that had clearly been made before I ever walked into the room. I asked him one question, just one. "Are you sure?" He didn't hesitate. He said yes. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not panic, clarity. I realized that this wasn't an emotional decision. It wasn't impulsive. It was planned. And more importantly, it was final. So I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I didn't remind him of everything I had built or everything I had done for him and his mother. I stood up, packed my office, shook hands with people who looked confused and uncomfortable, and walked out of the company that had defined most of my adult life. Daniel watched me leave without saying anything else. I think he expected me to come back, to call, to fight, to demand something. What he didn't understand was that my silence wasn't surrender. It was me taking inventory. The first few days after I left at the office felt unreal. Not because I didn't know what had happened, but because my mind hadn't caught up to my body yet. I woke up at the same time every morning out of habit. I reached for my phone expecting emails that never came. For years, my schedule had been dictated by meetings, deadlines, and problems that needed solving. Suddenly, there was nothing pressing me forward, and the silence felt heavier than any workload ever had. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call anyone from the company. Not out of pride, and not out of strategy. I simply didn't know what there was to say. The decision had been made, and I understood enough about power to know that arguing with it rarely changes anything in the moment. So I waited, not for revenge, but for clarity. I needed to understand what had actually been taken from me, and what, if anything, I still had. What became clear very quickly was that while I no longer owned a company, I still owned relationships. 2 weeks after I was fired, my phone rang. It was one of our largest clients. They didn't sound angry or accusatory, mostly confused. They told me Daniel had reached out with a proposal to optimize operations, cost reductions, outsourcing, automation. On paper, it all made sense. In reality, it disrupted systems that had taken years to stabilize. More importantly, it broke an unspoken agreement that changes would be deliberate, not rushed. Before hanging up, the client hesitated, then asked if I would consider consulting independently. I didn't say yes immediately, not because I was unsure, but because I needed to understand what saying yes would mean. I wasn't trying to take anything from Daniel. I wasn't trying to prove a point. I was being offered work by someone who trusted me, and trust, I had learned, doesn't disappear just because a title does. So I said yes. I didn't advertise my services. I didn't announce anything publicly. I didn't reach out to former clients. I let things unfold the way they were going to unfold. And unfold they did. Another client called, then another. Each conversation followed the same pattern: confusion about sudden changes, unease about direction, a quiet question about whether I was available. I began consulting from home. No office, no staff, no overhead, just me, my experience, and the same work I had always done. By the end of the year, Daniel's company had lost nearly half of its revenue. I didn't celebrate that. In fact, I didn't feel much of anything about it. What I felt was confirmation. Confirmation that the company's value had never been in its name, its logo, or its physical space. It had lived in relationships, in institutional knowledge, in the small decisions that no one notices until they're wrong. Eventually, Daniel tried to stop the bleeding. He filed a lawsuit claiming I had violated non-compete clauses. When I received the papers, I remember feeling a brief, almost ironic sense of recognition. I had written those clauses myself years earlier, at a time when I never imagined I'd be on the other side of them. They were intentionally narrow, designed to protect against bad actors, not someone continuing the same work independently. The case was dismissed quickly. After that, Daniel went silent. No calls, no messages, no further attempts to reach out. It was as if I had ceased to exist entirely. In some ways, that hurt more than the firing itself. In other ways, it confirmed what I had already begun to understand: that our relationship had never meant the same thing to both of us. I continued consulting, quietly, consistently. My days filled again with the same kind of work I had always done, just without the infrastructure I once thought was essential. What surprised me most was how little I missed that infrastructure: the office, the title, the sense of ownership. None of it mattered as much as I had believed. What mattered was that I still knew how to solve problems, and people still wanted me to do it. Looking back, I think Daniel believed that firing me would remove the past, that by cutting me out, he could start fresh, unburdened by the way things had always been done. What he didn't understand was that the past doesn't disappear when you remove a person. It lingers in habits, in expectations, in relationships that don't reset just because leadership does. I never spoke badly about him, not to clients, not to former employees, not to anyone. I didn't need to. The consequences of his decisions spoke for themselves, and as the months passed, The anger I expected to feel never really arrived. Instead, something quieter replaced it. Distance, perspective, a sense that whatever this situation had been about, it was no longer about me. About a year after everything happened, I saw Daniel again by accident. It wasn't planned. There was no dramatic setup. We crossed paths in a place neither of us expected to see the other, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked different, not drastically, but enough that I noticed it immediately. Tired mostly, older in a way that isn't about age, but about pressure. The kind that doesn't show up all at once, but accumulates quietly until it changes how someone stands, how they look at you, how long they hold eye contact. We exchanged a few polite words. Nothing personal, nothing confrontational. Just the kind of conversation two people have when both know there's too much history to address and no real reason to try. Then we went our separate ways. As I walked away, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't even feel angry anymore. What I felt was finished, like a door had closed on its own without me needing to push it. For a long time after that meeting, I kept thinking about the idea of revenge, because that's how most people would describe what happened next. They'd say I got my revenge, that things worked out in my favor, that Daniel got what he deserved, and maybe from the outside, that's how it looks. But that's not how it felt from the inside. I never planned to take anything from him. I never sat down and thought about how to hurt him or how to undermine the company. I didn't wake up in the mornings fueled by resentment or anger. What I did was step away and stop holding things together. And that's a very different thing. People underestimate how much effort it takes to keep something functioning. A business, a family, a relationship. From the outside, it looks stable, self-sustaining, solid. But underneath, there's always someone compensating for weaknesses, someone smoothing over mistakes, someone making sure small problems don't grow into large ones. For years, that person had been me. When Daniel fired me, he didn't remove a threat. He removed a support system. And he did it without fully understanding what that system actually was. I think that's what stayed with me the most. Not the betrayal itself, but how invisible my role had become. How easy it was for him to believe that the company would function the same way, without me simply because it had always functioned while I was there. He saw the results, but not the maintenance. That's a common mistake, not just in business, but in life. People assume stability is the default state of things, rather than something actively created every day by someone who rarely gets credit for it. After everything settled, my life didn't become extraordinary. It became quieter, simpler. I worked less, but more intentionally. I chose clients instead of chasing them. I stopped worrying about growth for the sake of growth. I didn't need to build anything big anymore. I had already proven to myself that I could. Sometimes people ask me if I regret trusting Daniel, if I would do things differently, knowing how it ended. I think about that question more than I probably should, and the honest answer is no. Not because trusting him was the right decision, but because distrusting him would have changed who I was. I didn't lose because I was naive. I lost because I chose loyalty in a situation where loyalty wasn't reciprocated, and that's not a flaw I want to remove from myself, even now. What I did learn is that silence is often misinterpreted. When I walked out of that office without a fight, Daniel thought I had given up. What I was actually doing was stepping back far enough to see the situation clearly for the first time. From that distance, it became obvious what still belonged to me and what never really did. The company, as a legal entity, was no longer mine, but the knowledge, the experience, the relationships, the ability to solve problems, those things don't get transferred in a folder across a desk. They stay with the person who earned them. People like to imagine revenge as something active, a plan, a confrontation, a moment of triumph. In reality, the most effective form of it is often passive. It's absence. It's what happens when you stop compensating for someone else's decisions and allow them to carry the full weight of those decisions themselves. I didn't destroy Daniel's company. I didn't take it from him. I didn't interfere. I simply stopped holding it together, and gravity did the rest.